Hey everybody, this is the stuff at the beginning of Negative Dialectics by Theodor W. Adorno, translated by E.B.Ashton. Table of contents. Translator's note, preface, introduction, and these are the sections of the introduction. The possibility of philosophy, dialectics not a standpoint, reality in dialectics, the concern of philosophy, the antagonistic entirety, disenchantment of the concept, quote, infinity, the speculative moment, presentation, attitude towards systems, idealism as rage, the twofold character of the system, the antinomical character of systems, argument and experience, vertiginousness, fragility and of truth, against relativism, dialectics and solidity, the privilege of experience, qualitative moment of rationality, quality and individual, substantiality and method, existentialism, thing, language, history, tradition and knowledge, rhetoric. Part 1 of Negative Dialectics. Part 1 of Negative Dialectics, Relation to Ontology. Chapter 1, The Ontological Need, Question and Answer, Affirmative Character, Incapacitation of the Subject, Being Subject-Object, Ontological Objectivism, The Disappointed Need, quote, deficiency equals profit, end quote. No Man's Land, Unsuccessful Realism, On Categorical Vision, Being something. This is something in another thing that I read by Adorno where it has, ancient Greek in new translation. Quote, sense of being, end quote, ontology prescribed, protest against reification, the wrong need, weakness and support. Chapter 2 of Part 1 is titled Being and Existence, and its sections are Immanent Critique of Ontology, Copula, No Transcendence of Being, Expressing the Inexpressible, The Child's Question, The Question of Being, Looping the Loop, Mythology of Being, Ontologization of the Ontical, Function of the Concept of Existence, quote, Dasein in itself ontological, unquote, the nominalistic aspect, existence authoritarian, quote, historicality, end quote. Part 2 of Negative Dialectics is titled Negative Dialectics, Concept and Categories. The indissoluble, quote, something, compulsory substantiveness, quote, peephole metaphysics, end quote, non-contradictoriness not to be hypostatized, relation to left-wing Hegelianism, quote, logic of disintegration, end quote, on the dialectics of identity, cogitative self-reflection, objectivity of contradiction, starting out from the concept, synthesis, critique of positive negation, individuality not the ultimate either, constellation in science, essence and appearance, indirectness by objectivity, particularity and the particular, subject-object dialectics, reversal of the subjective reduction, interpreting the transcendental, quote, transcendental delusion, end quote, the object's preponderance, the object not a datum, objectivity and reification, passage to materialism, materialism and immediacy, dialectics not a sociology of knowledge, the concept of mind, pure activity and genesis, suffering physical, materialism imageless. Part 3 of Negative Dialectics is titled Models. Chapter 1, Freedom. On the Metacritique of Practical Reason. And the sections are, quote, pseudo-problems, end quote. A split in the concern with freedom. Freedom, determinism, identity. Freedom and organized society. The impulse before the ego. Experimenta crucis. The addendum. The fiction of positive freedom. Unfreedom of thought. Quote, formalism, end quote. The will as a thing. Objectivity in the antinomy. Dialectical definition of the will. Contemplation. Structure of the third antinomy. Kant's concept of causality. The plea for order. The antithetical argument. Ontical and ideal moments. Repressive character of the doctrine of freedom. Self-experience of freedom and unfreedom. The crisis of causality. Causality as a spell. Reason, ego, superego. Potential of freedom. Against personalism. Depersonalization and existential ontology. Universal and individual in the philosophy of morals. On the state of freedom. Kant's, quote, intelligible character, end quote. Intelligibility and the unity of consciousness. Truth content of the doctrine of intelligibility. Chapter 2. World Spirit and Natural History. An excursion to Hegel. Trends and facts. Construction of the world spirit. Quote, harmonizing with the world spirit, end quote. The unleashing of productive forces. Group spirit and domination. The legal sphere. Law and equality. Individualistic veil. Dynamics of universal and particular. Spirit as a social totality. Historical reason antagonistic. Universal history. Antagonism contingent. The supramundane character of the Hegelian world spirit. Hegel siding with the universal. Relapse into Platonism. Detemporalization of time. Dialectics cut short by Hegel. The role of the popular spirit obsolete. Individuality and history. The spell, regression under the spell. Subject and individual. Dialectics and psychology. Quote, natural history, end quote. History and metaphysics. Chapter 3. Meditations on metaphysics. After Auschwitz. Metaphysics and culture. Dying today. Happiness and idle waiting. Quote, nihilism, end quote. Kant's resignation. Rescuing urge and block. Mundus intelligibilis. Neutralization. Quote, only a parable, end quote. The semblance of otherness. Self-reflection on dialectics. And here's the translator's note by, what's the translator's name again? Gotta give him props, E.B.Ashton. This book, to begin with an admission, made me violate what I consider the number one rule for translators of philosophy. Never to start translating until you think you know what the author means by every sentence, indeed by every word. It was done unwittingly. I have read the book in German, not too thoroughly, but never unsure of its theses. I clearly recall the thrust of what it conveys in a polished prose that had seemed eminently translatable. And so it turned out to be, not only because most of Theodor Adorno's philosophical vocabulary is of Latin or Greek stock and identical in English and German. His syntax rarely needs disentangling like that of most German philosophers since Kant. Adorno is not as addicted to making up words as they are. And the few neologisms he does use are borrowed from English. In the early stages of translation, I wonder now and then what one sentence might have to do with the preceding sentence and with the one before. But other readers told me of the same experience, and Adorno's own preface promised that what seemed baffling at first would be clarified later. Besides, I felt, there was no mistranslating Adorno's text. Adorno's sentences were clear. The words, his own that is, his discussions of other men's words are a different matter, were unequivocal. The English equivalents were beyond doubt. I plodded on, oblivious of my number one rule. But the enigmas piled up. I found myself translating entire pages without seeing how they led from the start of an argument to the conclusion. I was about to return the book as untranslatable, for me at least, when my favorite translator's story crossed my mind. A colleague, commissioned to translate a certain book, was asked whether he had had a chance to read it yet. Quote, "I do not read, I translate," end quote, was his reply. I put my nascent translation aside and did what I ought to have done in the first place. I reread Negative Dialectics, not at a fast clip, not for an overall view of the intellectual edifice, but examining brick after brick to see whether they were really thrown together helter-skelter, or there was some method in the madness. I found not one method, but several. Let me inject here that both ways of reading the book are legitimate, in my opinion. A reader as facile and literate as Adorno will make his points on two levels, line by line and impression by impression. What he wants to say comes through, even if you read as I first read it, and as probably many of its German readers have. If you savor the nuggets of wit, the darts of sarcasm, and get the drift while floating over problems on the ripples of a style that may, at best, approximate the smoothness of the German. If you do want to get to the bottom and dig, however, there are, I believe, three keys, not to Adorno's philosophy, but to Adorno's presentation. These three keys will unlock not the substance of Adorno's thinking, but the formidable formal gates along the way to it. Carried in mind, they will greatly ease one's path through Negative Dialectics. The first key is the title. In his preface, Adorno calls it paradoxical, explaining that one of Adorno's aims is to rid dialectics of such traditional affirmative traits as trying, quote, to achieve something positive by way of negation, end quote. Adorno. But this logical sense of negativity is not the one in which it is here pursued. In this book, the word, quote, negative has all the meanings found in an unabridged dictionary, and then some: logical, ethical, utilitarian, political, socioeconomic. The word negative may be used, or the word negative's use may be implied, in a purely vernacular sense at one moment, and the next moment in the esoteric sense of running counter to the philosophies of identity and non-contradictoriness. It is the implied use of, quote, negative, end quote, the multitude of passages avidly hunting the thing without mentioning the word, that perplexes readers who do not keep reminding themselves of the title. Its second word also has implications beyond philosophical usage. Much of this book is dialectical in the traditional sense of Platonic, Kantian, Hegelian dialectics, but all of it is dialectics in the popular commonplace sense of skilled argumentation. It never addresses itself to philosophical problems, always to other philosophies. There is a chapter against Heidegger, with a few swipes at Husserl and Jaspers, another against Hegel, a third against Kant. The targets cover an impressive range. Adorno spares neither idealists nor positivists of the 18th and 19th century, and Adorno savages the neo-ontologists, intuitionists, and existentialists of the 20th century. Sub rosa, Adorno polemicizes also against the 20th century Marxist establishment, which brings us to the second of the three keys. Quote, the author, end quote, Adorno ends his preface, quote, is prepared for the attacks to which negative dialectics will expose him. The author feels no rancor and does not begrudge the joy of those in either camp who will proclaim that they knew it all the time and now he was confessing, end quote. The two camps, quote, Huben und Drüben, are East and West, Marxist and anti-Marxist. To the latter, Adorno had nothing new to confess. Adorno had never made a secret of his convictions. But Adorno had striven long and hard against his doubts, and when he could not repress them any more, he felt obliged to defend them. At bottom, this book is an apologia for deviationism, a Marxist thinker's explication of his inability to toe the lines laid down today for proper Marxist thinking. The deviations to which he pleads guilty are numerous. Adorno accords primacy to facts over concepts, and to substance over form. Adorno holds that dark realities can eclipse dazzling ideas, and that theory, however non-contradictory, cannot undo a contradictory practice. Adorno contends that if non-identical objects belie the identity of subjectivism, even of collective subjectivism, that identity is not truth but a lie. And Adorno's defense of all this, the reason why a believer feels compelled to disavow articles of his own creed, is that the negativity of the concrete particular, of things as we see and experiences them in our time, makes his the true, the quote negative, end quote, dialectics. Concretely, all of these sins are epitomized in one sin, in the contention that history, all reinterpretations to the contrary notwithstanding, has failed to take the course predicted for history as a scientific necessity. Directly following the preface, the book itself opens with a flat statement of this cardinal heresy. Quote, philosophy, which once seemed obsolete, lives on because the moment to realize philosophy was missed. The summary judgment that it had merely interpreted the world, that resignation in the face of reality had crippled it in itself, becomes a defeatism of reason after the attempt to change the world miscarried, end quote. Two sentences one may be at loss to understand unless he remembers Marx's famous dictum about the philosophers who were content to interpret the world, quote, what matters is to change it, end quote. What matters here is the third key to reading this book. It follows with such allusions, with paraphrases of renowned and not so renowned quotations from men presupposed as familiar. Adorno has several ways of handling these. The original may be quoted at length in the text or in footnotes, leaving the parallel to be figured out by the reader. Or the authors, modern authors in particular, are named, assuming only that the reader will know them sufficiently to understand what specific line or aspect of their work is here referred to. But sometimes such aids are dispensed with altogether, on the assumption that whoever reads negative dialectics will instantly have the source in mind. The last procedure, I believe, will be responsible for most of the problems one may have in reading. The last procedure certainly was responsible for most of mine. To follow the line of thought from detail to detail, you need to know Kant near perfectly, Hegel perfectly, and Marx Engels viscerally, not just quote by heart, end quote. If you twitch whenever a phrase in this book resembles one from the Marxist founding fathers, then and not until then can you think along with Adorno. Besides, you should have a working knowledge of moderns from a variety of fields, of such philosophers as Bergson, Husserl, Scheler, Walter Benjamin, an anthology of whose work has lately appeared in English, and who may be the one object of Adorno's unqualified admiration, of prominent sociologists and psychiatrists, of seminal poets, Beckett, and composers, Schoenberg. Adorno is not only a philosopher, but one of the most knowledgeable musicologists of our time, and you should at least have heard of Karl Kraus of Vienna, the consummate intellectual jack of all literary trades, whose influence covered the German language area after the First World War, and had a revival of sorts after the second. You do not need to know Heidegger. The principal target of Adorno's polemics is the only one where he presupposes nothing, where every line he scorns is quoted in full, preliminary to dissection. The duels with Heidegger in the first half of this book will not stump the reader, as a rule, although some did stump the translator. For Martin Heidegger has always struck me as untranslatable, and despite the talent and effort invested in recent English versions of Heidegger's works, Heidegger still does strike me as untranslatable. Heidegger is a man who chose to put the gist of his philosophizing into the form of an argument with language. Being a German, Heidegger argues with the German language. To reproduce Heidegger's plays on German words, Heidegger's translators invented ingenious English words and word combinations. But the very point of the method is that in the source language, the words are neither ingenious nor invented. Like the means used to vary them, they are all commonplace, almost all Germanic, and carefully selected for both traits. Heidegger's most abstruse texts can be skimmed with a sense of familiarity by German readers, and this plays a major role in the philosophy. That a vocabulary of linguistic oddities will not produce the same illusion is clear. With Heidegger, time and again, there is simply no way to the equivalence that is the crux of translation. In 2 or 3 such cases, therefore, a few lines of the original have been omitted from this volume. They are not vital, merely reinforcing other exemplifications of the same points, and the alternative, to quote the German and to append footnotes with a translation bound to miss the point, an explanation of the inadequacy, and a further explanation of Adorno's comments on the mistranslated quotes, seem to me too horrible to contemplate. The passages Adorno quotes or paraphrases from Kant, Hegel, or Marx Engels posed a different problem. There are many Kant translations and some excellent Kant translations, but in the concrete case, these Kant translations' wording would not often lend itself to the Adorno variations. There are not many good Hegel translations, though the Josiah Royce version of Der Vernunft in der Geschichte, a work analyzed extensively in this book, ranks with the best. Looking forward to this chance to draw upon the late Professor Royce's English, I spent hours searching for his rendering of every quoted line. In vain, most of them were undiscoverable. To capture Hegel's spirit, the translator had stripped away the weak Hegelian flesh, but it is the flesh, unfortunately, that Adorno picks on. The official canonical English version of the works of Marx and Engels is in the opposite category. The flesh is there, but the spirit is that of the Leninist revision. The greatest translations have not escaped from such ideological service. After all, in one of our English Bibles, the Christmas message promises, quote, goodwill toward men, end quote, while the other limits it to, quote, men of goodwill, end quote. In the standard English Marx Engels, the original tenets are ever so slightly nudged in the direction of meanings given to them. As Adorno's heretical opening puts it, quote, after the attempt to change the world miscarried, end quote. Parenthesis, 3 little words repeated over and over in this book, quote, nach wie vor, end quote, now as before, keep us mindful of that miscarriage. Finally, it should be noted that each of these well springs of thought has its own variant of German philosophical usage, its own somewhat different understanding of the same terms, and that in English each new translation led inevitably to new differences within Hegel. For instance, besides adding to the original ones between Hegel and others. In negative dialectics, the consistent use of existing translations would have produced an unintelligible hodgepodge. What I decided to do instead, after much soul-searching, was to orient my work to the man I was translating. Wherever someone else is quoted, paraphrased, discussed, or alluded to, I would take Adorno's terminology, construction and meaning as the base on which to synthesize my own renderings of the text he refers to, regardless of how they may have been rendered elsewhere. It was he, after all, who dealt with them, who reasoned and argued with them, and here, to my mind, these dealings rather than their objects are of the essence. My responsibility, as I saw it, was to put Adorno's thought into English, not to keep Adorno's examples of other philosophers' thought in line with the English forms lent to them by other translators. If a reader has studied the German thinkers in English and fails to find here the expression he has come to be familiar with, I ask him to remember that this is Adorno's book, and to take my word for it that a comparison with the original text of the others will show that they were translated faithfully. Quote, I often wonder, end quote, a noted translator and critic wrote to me years ago, quote, how far writers like Benjamin, Lukács, Adorno say are ever going to make much mark in the English-speaking world. ... as long as translators do not risk their lives and think them into English. What does the reader with a quite different philosophical background, and often very little philosophical background of any sort, really make of them? End quote. For readers with no philosophical background of any sort, I am afraid the answer has to be not much in any language. And Lukács and Benjamin may indeed force a translator to take his life in his hands, even for a well-trained audience. But I like to believe that Adorno, who often seems to do his own thinking in English, requires no such valor. If you are aware that he is defending himself against attacks from, quote, either camp, end quote, if you recall that Adorno's armor is a dialectics built on relentless pursuit of the negative in every possible sense, and if you know the philosophies he uses, negatively as a rule, for his concretions and models, the encounter with his, quote, anti-system, end quote, as the German book jacket calls it, may prove a challenging and intriguing experience, even, I hope, in English. And that's the end of the translator's introduction by E.B.Ashton. And I'm going to read the short preface here. Actually, no, I'm going to cut the book off here. I'll read the preface for when I read the introduction.